So, I hear you have a scientific theory to tell me about.
Indeed. It's the idea that all human diseases, and even most human flaws, will one day be able to be fixed by manipulating people's genes.
Oh, eugenics.
Well, we don't really call it that anymore. We prefer the term genetic medicine.
Okay, but it still sounds a lot like eugenics.
It is, but something happens around the 1940s that made us change the way we talk about that idea.
You mean the Holocaust?
I try to conduct all my research without looking at any historical context. I find that it helps me stay truer to the science, you know?
Seems kind of dangerous to forget something like that.
Well, you know the saying, never forget, because you never learned it in the first place.
I don't think that's what that means, but go ahead.
Okay, so around the 1700s, a bunch of phrenologists.
I'm sorry. Did you say phrenologists?
Yeah,
The skull shape can predict your future, guys.
yeah, them.
Go on.
So these phrenologists were struggling to prove the superiority of the Nordics because they didn't have all the fancy technology we have today. So they looked at sets of twins, both identical and fraternal, and they figured since the environments are the same, that any differences between them must have been because of differences in the amount of genes they share.
Wait. Their claim was that the environment is experienced exactly the same for both identical and fraternal twins? That seems completely wrong. I mean, identical twins, they get dressed in the same clothes, they make the same friends, they do the same activities, and a lot of times they get confused for each other. So naturally, they see their twin as an extension of themselves. Clearly, the environment is shared more so in identical twins.
Well, we admitted that around the 1950s or so, but we kind of just kept doing our work.
Must have been difficult to continue the research when the foundational assumption is proven to be very incorrect.
Yeah, you would think so. So then we just kind of flipped what we were saying about the environments being the same, and thus proving that any differences must have been genetic, to then saying that the environments are very different, so then any differences must have been genetic.
Wait, the differences in environment are also genetics?
Exactly.
How so?
So everyone agrees that looks are highly genetic, like your sloping brow and cranial bummage.
Thank you.
So, since looks are genetic,
Okay.
and people get treated differently based on looks,
Go on.
then anything where two people interact will count as genetics.
So you consider a hot girl getting out of a speeding ticket a genetic trait?
Basically.
Well, then anything that could be impacted by human interaction could count as genetic.
Exactly.
So income would be genetic because good-looking people get paid more?
That's right. For example, intelligence is 80%, crime 75%, and the enjoyment of sailing 80%.
Sailing is genetic. Holy Mary, Mother of God.
65%.
Excuse me?
Christianity is 65% genetic.
Wait, what? Christianity is genetic. Did these Christian genes just come out of nowhere 2,000 years ago? Do Catholics have the same set of Christian genes as Protestants?
Do Catholics and Protestants consider themselves to be different? Aren't they both Christian descendants?
Well then, did ancient Jews have these genes but nobody else in the Middle East?
I don't know. Has anyone ever tried to spread Christianity in the Middle East before?
Boy, you really didn't pay attention in history class, did you?
I did not. But we ran the math, and we found that the differences between both fraternal and identical twins identifying as Christian shows that Christianity is mostly genetic. But if you are only looking for differences between identical and fraternal twins, then having opposable thumbs or two ears, all those would be 0% genetic because both sets of twins would have them.
I guess so. Seems like you might want to find a better method if the one you have suggests that owning a sailboat is almost entirely genetic, but having a spine is purely environmental.
Yeah, you would think so. But we decided to just admit that caveat and carry on like it was no big deal.
But don't migration and adoption studies show that where someone is raised is much more important than their genetic makeup for everything besides single gene diseases?
I'm not required to address data that doesn't fit my narrative.
I think most scientists would disagree. But don't we have genetic tests that could just measure the genes directly? So we don't have to use twin studies to guess at whether genes are responsible for complex traits. we can measure those genes and see if those genes are responsible for those traits, right?
Yeah.
And when people do measure the genes, what are the differences they find?
Well, we don't like to talk about those results, okay? Because they're based off bad technology.
We can sequence someone's entire genome in a morning on a smartphone. How much more technology do you want?
Enough to prove I'm right.
I don't think that's how science works.
Does for me.
Seems fair. Sure, Ponce de Leon would have found the fountain of youth if he would have had GPS.
Unless he used Apple Maps.
Have they found any specific genes that can predict complex societal traits?
I don't understand why we would have to identify exact genes when we have inheritance studies.
Those twin studies were supposed to predict the amount of genes we would eventually find, right?
Yeah.
Well, if twin studies predicted 80% of what we'd expect to see in the sequence of the genome, wouldn't you expect to find at least one genetic sequence that mattered? Like if you were standing outside on a warm, sunny day, but your weather app said it was downpouring, wouldn't you think maybe the weatherman got it wrong?
Maybe.
Or maybe you are in a downpour, but each individual rain droplet is so teeny tiny that you can't even feel that you're getting soaking wet. I guess that seems plausible. But if twin studies suggest that intelligence is 80% genetic, how much do those gene tests find?
Less than 5%.
How many IQ points would that even account for?
2 at most.
2 IQ points? So if we did a full swing genomic medicine program, we could maybe bring the average IQ up 2 points from 100 to 102? Pretty neat, huh? Sure, if you ignore the historical policy implications, like genocide, slavery, not allowing the Irish to apply for jobs. That was forever ago. Actually, eugenics inspired forced sterilizations of people with disabilities all the way through the 90s.
That was forever ago.
You know I meant the 1990s, right?
I'm just going to stick with that being forever ago and just promise to never forget.
Yeah, again, not what it means. But I am wondering, if genetics might add 2 IQ points, what might something like a good night's sleep earn?
10.
Financial security?
Over 15.
A nutritious breakfast? 7. But the waitress serving you that nutritious breakfast will be a lot nicer to you if you're good looking.
So that counts as genetic.
Ah, excellent point. But don't genetic tests show that any 2 people are 99.8% genetically identical? Let's take the former and current president of the United States. So you're telling me the 0.2% genetic difference between them accounts for the majority of all the ways they're different? All of them?
That's what we're going with.
Okay.
Besides, it might not be that the genes are different. It could just be that the frequencies of sequences are different so that certain genetic variations are more common in some groups than others.
But that still doesn't tell you whether genetics cause the social groupings or it's just results of how you put the group of people together.
What do you mean?
Well, there are genetic differences between people that speak French to people that speak German. But that's only because people that speak French tend to mate with people that speak French. It doesn't mean that there's a francophone gene or a gene that could replace second language classes. You get that, right? Por supuesto. Okay, fine. When people study genetic frequencies instead of the genes themselves, what have they found? One group claims that they found gene variants more frequent in people with higher education. They say those variants can explain 12% of whether someone goes to grad school. But I still don't see how they explain away reverse causation.
Oh, that sounds kinky, you naughty boy.
No. Reverse causation here would be genetic differences caused from social differences, and not the other way around.
Oh, that's not at all what I was thinking.
Obviously. Let's use another example. When people study, let's say, Christians' genes versus Muslim genes, they find subtle differences. The obvious reason is that Christians tend to marry other Christians, and then they have kids who they raise to be Christians, and so on, and so on, and so on. Obviously, people leave and join churches every day, but the same mating principle can be applied to all religious groups.
Okay, but I don't see why that matters. Well, no one, other than, I guess, your Institute for Anti-Semitic Skull Measurements, would think that finding genetic differences between Christians and Muslims means that there is a gene for Christianity, or even contributing to being Christian. Like, no one would think that we could mutate a few genes in an atheist and turn them into an evangelical, right? I guess not. Well, then finding the differences between, let's say, a rich graduate student and a poor high school dropout should prompt the same way of thinking. Because on average, people tend to mate with people of their same educational status, backgrounds, religion, language, stuff like that. And this means that over enough generations, those mating patterns will show up as slight separations in the gene pools. But these genetic differences are the result of societal differences and not their cause. But we have a new way of calculating genes, and it's called a polygenic score, and it supports our theories. So, regular math wasn't giving you the answers you wanted, so you decided to just invent your own math. Sounds brilliant, huh? More like you turned a Ouija board into a math equation.
How dare you say that genes have no impact?
Did I actually say that?
No, sorry. I have a wee bit of an Irish temper,
I'm assuming you paid for one of those expensive ancestry tests. You know it's legit, because no company would ever go through all the effort of weaving an elaborate narrative just to prop it up the ignorance of their customers. True that. It just seems that the actual genetic data shows that genetic contributions are not zero, but they are also no more than a few percentage points. But if I admit that genetic differences are the results rather than a cause, then I'll have to try to change society into a nurturing environment instead of just, giving my kid a drug that turns him into a mega genius, sports star, or music prodigy. Oh, turning to science fiction to justify your political laziness is so hot. But isn't the profound success of the American creed an argument that people can come from various ethnicities and thrive in the right environment? That's only true for the people and groups that I like. Seems like the actual science would argue that allowing all people in and giving them access to shelter, food, drink, and tending to their illnesses would allow all to thrive. That sounds like the kind of thing a sandal-wearing, bearded hippie would say.
That's an oddly specific insult, but okay. But your claims imply that even for current natural-born citizens, no improvement in education or economic opportunities could help a poor kid in a rural area keep up with a college town professor's kid, because any gap would be stitched into the rural kid's DNA. You're almost implying that a West Virginian kid whose parents dropped out of high school is incapable of graduating from Harvard?
Maybe not incapable, but that rural kid is going to have to overcome some inborn inferiority to succeed with the coastal elite. History argues otherwise. I mean, it would be one thing to argue that some people might have to go through a certain level of culture shock to thrive in a new place, but enlighten me on just how biologically inferior you think someone from West Virginia is to, let's say, a Bostonian. Well, there's actually an entire circuit of famous speakers that talk about people who go to elite liberal arts universities and how they're innately superior to those who can't. I'm guessing that they only give those speeches at the elite liberal arts universities. Of course, you'd hate to rile the common folk. County fair enough. But I don't really like to talk about my biologic inferiority arguments using the example of poor white people versus rich white people. But such framing seems obvious. Well, people have been destroyed for talking about this subject outside of elite circles. Do you mean destroyed as in people disagreeing with them online, or destroyed as in getting shot dead for simply attending synagogue? Destroyed as in only getting a 6-figure book deal compared to a 7-figure book deal. Oh, that's horribly maligned. But I guess it's easy to say that genetics are destiny when you are a millionaire professor and not a blue-collar worker that just got laid off. But it is a lot easier to ignore helping people if I'm allowed to pretend that they are biologically incapable of being helped. Oh, turning to pseudoscience to justify your selfishness is so hot. But might telling a person that is financially struggling that their demographics should make them biologically superior encourage racial resentment? Not my problem. That doesn't sound like the prescription for a healthy society. Well, speaking of prescriptions, I think that if a doctor doesn't focus on their patient's race, that minorities will get worse healthcare. So you think healthcare should be separate but equal? Exactly. And remember, we don't count that as racism impacting the environment. We count it as genetic, under the assumption that genes determine race. So which genes make somebody white or make somebody black? Oh, and which genes should I swap out so I can become Asian? You'd think multiple decades and billions of dollars worth of genetic studies would have figured that out by now. There must be a conspiracy to suppress the truth. You find it more likely that there's been a decades-long conspiracy involving thousands of scientists from hundreds of universities and private businesses, rather than the idea that researchers from that era that didn't think that surgeons needed to wear gloves or wash their hands after they went poop might have gotten this wrong. Perhaps the overwhelming modern data is correct in saying that race may be a meaningful perception, but there aren't any genes responsible for it? Well, I've spent so much time writing articles claiming future genetic studies would vindicate me that continuing to do so seems less embarrassing than admitting that I got it wrong. Makes sense. Besides, if black people, on average, have slightly different results on specific blood tests than average white people, doesn't it make sense that doctors could racially profile their patients instead of ordering the blood testing? Not at all, actually. And I'm pretty sure healthcare for everyone is worse off when doctors start using race as a shortcut. How would I even begin to look into that? Books? Well, genetics can help in other ways. For example, my cousin is using genetic testing to find the underpinnings of heart disease. Will his test point to junk food, smoking, and a lack of exercise? No. I mean, diet and exercise? And you're sure he knows what the word underpinning means? Rude. I'd rather believe that all cures can be found in the 0.2% of genetic difference, rather than believing fairy tales like healthy eating and safe environments. Claiming that genetics are going to solve the problems clearly related to the modern lifestyle seems almost as irresponsible as similar claims related to intelligence. Less bigoted, but still very irresponsible. Okay, let me level with you. Part of me really just wants to prove that I'm smarter than religious people. And when someone asks me why two people are different, religious people get to just say God's will. So I need DNA to replace their dogma and claim that genes explain everything, so I can convert people to atheism. Couldn't God work through a molecule as well as a miracle? I don't believe so. The important thing is to know that genetics proves that religious people have outdated and dangerous beliefs. Wait, believing in religion is dangerous, but supporting eugenics is not? Well, any examples of eugenics being used to commit atrocities is just the fault of the religions at the time. Well, that take fits with your knowledge of history, but there are plenty of examples of religion bringing value and doing good in people's lives. Is there even one example of a eugenics program that was used for good? How would I even begin to look into that? Books. Look, I don't even work on any of that controversial stuff, okay? Our group works on using genetics to trace human migration, figuring out whether ancient humans migrated from Siberia to Europe or the other way around. Sure, but it does seem reckless to not adequately stress that genetic differences might allow you to trace when humans migrated into America. But those genes don't define what makes an American today. Well, I, for one, don't think scientists should ever have to take the responsibility of the implications of their work. So Frankenstein's monster should have just been called some monster that just kind of showed up somehow. Exactly. Especially because those snobby scientific conferences never invite speakers that have opinions that run counter to the established data and proven facts. Yeah, those. Would you expect a geophysics conference to invite flat earthers? Well, if you don't listen to every single disproven belief, then you hate free speech. Good point. That does actually remind me of the NASA conference I went to last year, where we spent the whole time debating whether the moon was made out of cheese. See, they get it. Overall, what do you think? It seems as if you have a well-meaning attempt to treat some diseases with obvious genetic causes that's being used as a cover for long-debunked theories of cultural elitism, racial supremacy, or, at best, opposition to assistance programs.
The genuine researchers in the field are well-intentioned, but many seem to ignore the historical implications and fail to contextualize just how small their identified genetic contribution is to the overall picture of a complex trait or complex disease. This gets filtered through reporters who are poorly equipped to communicate the distinctions, and that gets sent off through a social media sphere that is more dedicated to traffic than the truth.
Right. But the people that traffic that site and see our ads will make us money.
That's right. Oh, why didn't you just say that in the beginning? Besides, it's not like any of our work endorsing the idea of innate superiority of certain groups could send people down a path of radicalization that ends in the listener deciding to attack the groups we imply to be both inferior and an existential threat to their social status.
Books.